lunch here, and I'm delighted to introduce Christian Bason, who is a partner in our network. So we have the MacArthur Research Network on Open and Governance, and Christian is a critical member, and besides being a member, which of course takes most of his time, besides being a member, he also runs an organization called MindLab. And some of you might have already been exposed with MindLab, because MindLab is one of our favorite organizations. So that's the reason why we have two people presenting MindLab in our ideas lunches this term. And MindLab, I'm not going to explain what MindLab is. Besides saying is that it is similar to the place where we are here. It is an innovation lab to look at how can you actually govern differently. And the interesting thing about MindLab is that it actually is within government, as opposed to other labs that might be outside of government. Before he joined and actually was part of the creation of MindLab, he was doing consultancy work at Randball, which focused on public organization and management. And he is here in New York, in part because he's also connected and affiliated with the Parsons Institute, where he is completing his PhD. With that, I think you have enough information to get going. And Christian, it's all yours.
Thanks. So I'm sorry that MindLab is more or less infiltrating the MacArthur network this spring, but also I'm really pleased that we have this opportunity to share some of our work. And I spoke with my colleague Jesper. I don't know how many of you, if any, except for Stefan, saw Jesper when he was here. Did anyone? All right, so I'll be trying to not repeat too much of what he said, and especially in terms of cases, and probably at some of the angles or some of the ideas that I'll share with you. So let's get started. Let me start with a case example. In Denmark right now, we are preparing the largest reform of the public school system for 500,000 students. And about 61,000 teachers to start in August of this year. And that means, of course, that there's many reform processes undergoing. And we are at MindLab involved in some of them with the Ministry of Education, which you see in this photo here. It looks like an ancient building. It probably is from the 17th century. But of course, just like here in New York, when you talk about school reform, of course we talk about digital, we talk about new learning forms. In Denmark, we are blending all kinds of intelligences and learning styles in a full whole school day, where until recently kids would go to school until noon if you were a first or second grader. In the future, they'll go to school until 2 or 3 o'clock, and most kids will go to school a full day. As part of the reform, we're also reforming the targets or the curriculum for teachers to be guided by. So what are the learning steps? So you could say the core curriculum, just like you have here in the United States. I know a discussion in Denmark we've adopted for some years now a set of guidelines and core curriculum and also tools for evaluation. And part of the reform is also to reform that. Of course, with the ultimate objective that kids will experience something different when they meet the teachers, when they're in the classroom, when they're engaged in learning. These are artifacts, design artifacts, or this is a prototype that we worked with at MindLab to ask the question: if you were to develop or redesign a portal for teachers to use as a tool across the country, when applying these new revised targets for kids, new learning styles, using materials, teaching materials, downloading information, getting hold of educational evidence, what might that look like? And to facilitate that, we did ethnography among teachers. We spent time in observation studies in classrooms. We did interviews. We also spoke with school principals. And informed by that research, we built a set of very simple tools, a simple game, a design game, which had various elements. There's a grabber, which will help you grab evaluation knowledge and evidence. There's a magic straw you see up here, which will give you access to all information in the world you want. There's a curation, there's a translation machine from one language to another. And basically the design question here was, if you could do anything you wanted with a web platform to support your teaching, what would it look like? And in that dialogue, we invited, of course, teachers. And we invited the Department of Education. And we supported, facilitated their playing the game, imagining what this tool might be in a very hands-on physical way, driven by metaphor, driven by these different types of tools. One surprising thing that happened during the conversation was that we realized that the mere thought of implementing this new tool by August 1st and making it mandatory for teachers to use it and to apply it in practice in the classroom was going to be a very, very, very hard sell. There was almost tears in the eyes of one of the teachers we had in the workshop that this is on top of everything else that's happening with this reform, new scheduling. This is just going to be too much. And not just because of this input, but partly because of this input, we've now, with the ministry decided, or the ministry has decided, the minister has decided to postpone the full implementation and scaling of these tools until a year after the reform starts, and to really use the first year for learning, for prototyping, and for piloting further. So what I want to say with this, to start off with, is that redesigning governance is about understanding, of course, what happens on the outside of public systems when kids engage with teachers, with materials in the classroom. But it is also very, very much about a conversation between the public servants at all different levels and the professionals in the front line, teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers, business advisors, those who engage with citizens. And too often, we forget that to redesign a system, you need to engage that system. So the system itself, the people within the system can discover for themselves what is meaningful, sensible, what can be done, in what sequence might it be done, what would be valuable to us, to me, in this situation, in our context. And that's going to be a red thread through my presentation, that this is something that we tend to forget. And at MindLab, when we started out in the most recent iteration here 7 years ago, we thought it was all about users. It was all about the citizens. It was all about the outside in. We spent 80% of our time researching and doing ethnography among citizens, but now we're realizing that we might as well spend up to 80% of our time doing ethnography and understanding the cultures within the public service. Because basically the redesign is on both sides. And if you want to keep any kind of impact that is over long term and sustainably makes a difference for citizens, then the system needs to be redesigned. So this is basically what we do. We work with our owners. We work with our funding partners, the ministries of education, Ministry of Employment, Ministry of, part like the Department of Labor here, the Ministry of Business, which here would be the Department of Commerce, and one city government, the city of Odense, which is the third largest city in Denmark, which means a couple of 100,000 inhabitants. That's it. It's a nice size to sort of work with as a prototype as well. We work with our colleagues, with our owners, being civil servants ourselves, to discover what will it take to change systems so we create the intended outcomes, the intended changes for people and for society. That's our mission, which means we're not a consultancy, we're not suppliers of processes, but we are collaborators in an equal partnership with our colleagues. It means also that we can say, very occasionally, but we can actually say no thank you to a piece of work where we don't believe we can add value. We are governed by a board of the permanent secretaries. These are the senior executives of these organizations. And basically here, this is our mission, our strategy statement, but this basically says that what we do is we don't just co-decide or co-create with citizens, we also involve actively the stakeholders inside and outside government that we need to engage. So, for example, that could be the National Confederation of Danish Industry, who I, by the way, know actually works in this building here and has a little team working here in New York. Well, they may need to be part of a process if we're looking at redesigning business policy, for example. And they have been over the years on several occasions. MindLab is also a collaborative space. Apologies to those of you who heard this already before, ethnographers, anthropologists, people with media science backgrounds, IT, interaction design, designers, and political scientists like myself. When you work with redesigning systems, it helps to understand at least partly the system you're part of. That's why we also emphasize that people at MindLab have a public management background who understand cultures, values, theories, practices, policy making. We believe that's really about public business development, but to understand public business development, you have to understand the public sector. Yeah, so I'm doing this doctoral research at Copenhagen Business School, and my interest really is about how public managers can engage with design, and this is some of the findings from my research I'll share with you today. Very proud to be part of the MacArthur Network and working with our colleagues here in the US and elsewhere on opening governance and seeing how both digital approaches to collaboration, to ideation, but also digital solutions can be part of creating a better public sector. And as mentioned, I'm currently visiting scholar at the New School for Design, which has a really interesting program on public and collaborative design, and works with the New York City administration and various projects as well. Finally, I need to mention some of the books we've written together, and most recently, this is probably most of interest for some of you, that this book is coming out in the fall, which is basically an anthology with lots and lots of chapters on lots of chapters on, including a contribution from Eduardo here, on what does design mean for policymaking. Okay, so I'm going to go around looking at three things. First, governance, then design, and then leadership. To redesign governance, it's not enough to just consider governance and design. We also have to think about who is going to lead, who is going to steward the process, and what is that going to take? What is that going to take for a mid-level manager in the city of New York, in the administration? What kind of relationship or engagement with design will that require? My experience is that if public managers do not engage in certain ways with design, it's a waste of time, and we might as well just stop. You could call that engaging with innovation processes, engaging with a new development form, but it's not easy and it's challenging. And we need to think about the leadership capabilities to work with these kind of processes. And I think those of you who work very much with technology will probably recognize some of the leadership challenges you're finding in adopting, for example, new technologies in organizations. Let's take a look at governance first. So this is my own definition of what governance is. There are other definitions. This is one approach. I would say that the keywords are really about how do we achieve desired outcomes, such as learning, thriving in the school system, health, better social outcomes, jobs, growth, sustainability, so forth. And how do we do it in the smartest possible way at the lowest possible cost? I should say, being in the US, at the lowest possible cost to taxpayers. Because sometimes it's about leveraging other resources than public sector resources to achieve outcomes. But when I say lowest possible cost or lowest possible expenditure of resources, what I mean is finding smart ways where we don't have to necessarily grow government, but we can maybe find other partners who can help us achieve outcomes. There's a lot of talk about a paradigm shift in governance these days. Actually, there's been a lot of talk for the last at least a decade, maybe 15 years. But we haven't seen the new paradigm yet anywhere. Recently, here in 2014, another partner from the MacArthur Network, Jeff Mulgan from Nesta in the UK, wrote a paper on rewiring the brain, which is basically about how we organize central governments. Guess what? Central government is organized almost the same anywhere you look in the developed world. We have no divergence. We don't see any real experimentation in how we organize central government. And I would argue that we see, of course, a bigger variation on local government, but still, it's amazing how We don't see much divergence in how we organize the public sector. But finding the next governance model must be about exploring divergent possibilities. Nonetheless, academics and practitioners have begun to propose some of the language that we may need or may look to understand what the future model of governance could look like. So, language such as activating citizens' resources, that's part of the civic engagement charter of the Danish government, which was adopted last year. From transactional welfare, transactions are what you do in banks, transactions are what you do in large-scale mass production systems, production services, to relational welfare, which is about engaging at an empathetic level with individuals and understanding over time how to grow mutually beneficial, sustainable relations and relationships. Something that the government and the public sector is really not very good at. To give you an example, I have a son who has a mental disability. When I meet with my caseworker in Copenhagen, in Denmark, my caseworker, my family's caseworker, will come up and say, "So, what do you need?" And Denmark being a welfare state, there are lots of things we could receive from the state, compensation for maybe loss of work income, various tools for our son, educational tools and so forth. But I don't really care about what we need. What I care about is whether Christopher is thriving or not. And that is a relational issue. His relations to his community, in the family, with his friends, getting friends. It's a question about understanding who he is and who our family, what our family's like. So last time I met with our caseworker, I said, why don't we talk about Christopher instead of talking about the transactions, about what we can get? And the caseworker was almost baffled and said, well, you're kind of right, because I suppose it's all about him, isn't it? And my wife and I said, yeah, it's pretty much about him. So this is the kind of paradigm we're in, and it is not just an abstract conversation, it's a real tangible one, because it has to do with what happens when hundreds of thousands of citizens in a country like my country engage with public servants, professionals in the front line. From professional quality to experience quality, I'm mentioning the Danish regions here because they run our hospitals. And at one quite public conference, the director of the Danish region, so that's the administrative director of the Danish healthcare and hospital sector, he said, why are we governing the sector in a way where actually we pay hospitals for their activities? So the more patients you have, the more income you get, the more funding you get. That's the way to ensure an activity-based funding model. But doesn't that mean that we pay hospitals more if the patients come back again? We've built an entire healthcare system where you reward hospitals for not doing the job and not helping citizens, patients to become healthy and not come back to hospital. And he wondered out loud, the person responsible for the system, how might that be? And maybe we could redesign it. Finally, our partners in the city of Odense in Denmark talk about a shift from a rights-based or a model of welfare to one that's outcome-based, which is basically saying, as a citizen, you do not have the right to certain services or offerings. What you do have the right to is an equality of outcomes. We will do anything it takes for us to ensure that, for example, as a child, a low-income family, the outcome for you will be as good as possible in terms of finishing university, getting a job, or whatever level of education you want. It's not a question of your right to access to education, it's a question of your right to certain outcomes. And that's the equality, that's the kind of welfare we want. That shift from a rights-based, legal-based model to an outcome-based model is a very, very fundamental one if we're able to make it. So, not just at MindLab, but elsewhere, one proposal is that what we're talking about in terms of governance is co-production, to produce welfare, produce outcomes with people, not for them. And co-production holds and quite a few interesting, I think, also sort of intellectual pieces, especially saying that any service, any interaction, of course, is a co-production of a service. Otherwise, you're not relating to people, you're relating to a blank wall, inanimate matter. I mean, basically, any service is a co-production, but we don't really recognize that. We design systems and governance as if we're producing to people and delivering things to people. that means that actually we built our entire governance legacy around a model like this, pushing rules, regulations, transactions to people, where what we should do is to redesign governance around something that looks more like this. The problem is that nobody knows exactly what that looks like in healthcare, in social services, in education. Getting to something like this is a bit of a mystery. How do we hit the target? How do we come closer to something that is where we know we intuitively probably should be going, given that we're asking all these questions, given that we've had 15 years of public management theorists saying that the paradigm of new public management is probably something we should discard for something else? We've found out that the market mechanism doesn't always work for public services. We found out that you can't just contract out or build contractual relations between agencies. It turns out it's not really working that well. And that's a uniform insight across most Western and developed countries. How many of you are familiar with David Snowden and his work on complexity? A few of you? Yeah. So the rest of my argument today is going to be about that discovering the next governance model has to be informed by what we know about working with complexity or complex phenomena in a social or in a management setting. If we could just find best practices, knowing that this one model of governance worked, we'll just apply that everywhere. But that doesn't really exist. We don't even really know what the various good practices are. In fact, the whole right side column of this model, what it says is that if we know causalities, A causes B, then we can just apply either good practices or at least best practices. The problem is, in complex settings, social systems, and I would say many governmental systems, we don't even know what the causalities in the system are. We don't know whether A causes B or A causes C. Or maybe the causality is opposite, that B causes A. We have to explore it. And that is why the interesting piece of this model is this piece here, saying that actually the discovery or the identification of governance is emergent. It's something we have to experiment with. We have to probe, we have to try stuff out, we have to discover it. And also we have to discover it, because the success of public sector reform stands and falls with whether it makes sense to the people, the professionals, the administrators, the policymakers within the system that are going to change what they do. And you cannot help them make sense if they're not engaged in it, which means, again, you cannot help them make sense of it if you don't involve them in the discovery process. What you do over here is basically to analyze and categorize, and then you push top down a certain model or system. What you do over here is you collaborate to find out what the model might be for you. Maybe, again, respecting certain fundamental principles we think are important, but nonetheless with a huge space for discovery. And that is what is going on across the globe. 2 weeks ago, I worked in London with the Cabinet Office, the British government. They just launched an open policy lab, partly inspired by MindLab, partly inspired by other similar structures, where the idea is, well, we have to recognize that we have to break open the public sector. We have to break open Whitehall in London for new inputs, to receive feedback, to engage other stakeholders, engage end users, work differently with other agencies and departments. And now, for one of the first times, I think, pretty much ever, the Cabinet Office has basically said, let's facilitate some collaboration rather than just tell you what to do. Because telling people what to do doesn't seem to work that well. This process requires, at least in our experience at MindLab and the experience I have from my research, 3 different types of processes. I would call that, let's just call it design approaches or design processes. So let's shift a little bit to the second piece, which is design. First, design has to be about, or the redesign has to be about professional empathy, about coming really deep in and understanding who are we doing this for, when and how are we doing right now. In part to understand where is the system dysfunctional today. In part to be inspired about how it might be changed for the better. So that could be doing ethnography in a kindergarten, getting down in the same height as a 2-year-old child and following that kid around. This won't be on the webcast now. And video filming a day in the life of a 2-year-old toddler, or a day in the life of a 5-year-old preschooler. And then showing the video footage to the staff. Not the parents first, but the staff in the kindergarten. And asking them, what do you think? What does this tell you about scheduling, about planning, about conflict, about play, about games, about aesthetics, about learning, about thriving? I was involved in that in a kindergarten in Copenhagen. And when we suggested to the staff, the professionals, we're going to, I was a parent on the parents' board, we're going to go out and video film the kids. What do you think the reaction was? We're going to take a video camera and look at your professional practices. And you'll just follow 2 kids, not all of them, not a representative sample, but 2. They said, no thanks. And the director, or the leader of the kindergarten said, if we don't do something like this as an institution, we die. So we did. And they loved it. And we had a great conversation. But there was a huge resistance to allowing that kind of work, and also to being humble enough, perhaps, to take a look at what are you doing. It could be, as we did in Mind Lab, to explore what does it feel like to be this Indian engineer arriving in the snow in Copenhagen in December and spending the next 4 years of his life and with his family working for Danish companies and being one of the attractive knowledge workers we want more of in Denmark. And playing audio clips of interviews with him and others to a senior policy-making committee from 5 different ministries to help them gain empathy with his life experience. Which, for example, was that when his second child was born in Denmark, he couldn't give his son the name he wanted because we have a list in Denmark of approved names. And this strange Indian name was not on the list. What do you think it makes him feel like to not being able to give the son the name he wants? It might make him feel like moving to London and working there instead. And there are some policy implications of this for the system, just as one example. Or it could be this, ethnography amongst individuals with a serious work injury, exploring their interactions with the public system in getting an insurance settlement because they got injured while working, and discovering that the whole bureaucratic process of case management, at least at that time, which is about 5 years ago, meant that people became more sick than they were already, basically from the case management. Receiving 23 letters on average, asking them questions about how ill are they, what's their loss of work capability, have you been exposed to asbestos, even though what you actually are suffering is a broken back. It basically meant that you became the work injury, that became your personal identity, and providing that video footage back to the public servants who are managing the system, including the director. And now the agency has been using that video footage to train new employees to say, this is not how we want to relate to citizens. And they've redesigned quite a few of the systems that are the digital systems, letters, and so forth that are engaging with these citizens. And by the way, where design comes into place, for example, like mapping the service journey of the users, like here. This is Danish, of course, but this is the service journey of an injured worker. You see the letters, the phone calls, the interactions, the green flashes are places where there are pain points where things just break down and don't work for people, where things don't make any sense to people. That's where you get even more sick than you were already. Another example is a mapping of a service process for business. So basically what design helps us do is to explore what is it for kind of reality that's going on out there. What does it look like from the outside perspective, from the outside end? The second is, how do we work with our public colleagues? How do we work within the public sector system at all levels to create more divergence of ideas, even dangerous ideas, even crazy ideas? How do we work with exploring possible futures and scenarios for what might we be able to do? How do we get a proactive, forward-looking, future-oriented, and I suppose future-oriented works well in this space we're in here, right? A future-oriented stance, not a reactive stance, just reacting to public problems, but actually envisioning what might we do. So this is, of course, about brainstorming. It's about engaging people substantially in discussing and thinking about how could they change their own work. It's also inspiring them with new governance ideas, new technological ideas, digital ideas that they may not have on their radar at all. Maybe they have never heard about crowdfunding or crowdsourcing, or heard about social impact bonds, or heard about network governance, or other ways which they might approach their challenges. Helping them prioritize and sort out ideas, discussing what will have the highest impact, what will the cost be, assessing ideas. Very long text. This is an agency working on business statistics. And what the text shows is that there's no communication going on between these two agencies. It turns out that this employee, when guiding businesses in how they register their business statistically online, uses a paper manual, a 1,000-page European Union manual with statistical codes for business. And the updates that she's making in the manual with little post-it notes and writing in, it's not something she's sharing with the other agency, of course, because it's on paper. By that way, we have a system that just becomes dumber and dumber over time, and it becomes more and more siloed over time. So why is this important? It's important because the kinds of processes we're talking about need to be collaborative. They need to be across the public sector system, across agencies, across departments, across levels of government. And the way that most public agencies today develop any new idea or any new solution is not that way. At best, if they ever involve anyone else in a development process, it's in a meeting, telling other agencies what they are going to be doing, not collaborating around problem solving and finding out that maybe a solution to this one, by the way, is a digital learning platform for the public service, which we then built at MindLab and proposed, and they're implementing now. The third design process is about rehearsing the future. It is about beginning to probe, to test, and by the way, these three elements are not necessarily in a sequence. This could also be the starting point of a process. It might not be the third step in a process. Finding out what will actually work. What would work for someone in the system, outside the system? How would we engage differently with people? So normally when I'm in the United States, I will always have to take sort of this, well, Denmark is a small country, 5 million people. It's less than live in New York City. United States, 300 million people. It's bigger, it's more complex. You can't really apply these methods. Well, this photograph is taken of a process I was chairing where we were running new ideas for the European Union, which is 500 million citizens. What we're testing here is a prototype for an angel fund, a financial initiative for all public administrations across the European Union, 28 countries, again, well, millions and millions and millions and millions of public servants. And here we're testing the idea with Danish public servants. So we are a member of my committee, the European Union Committee, who's sharing a concept, a prototype with a senior public servant in Denmark. And by the way, they kind of loved it, so there was a go. There was another idea in our group, which was about, let's just give best practice examples. Let's build a repository of best practices and put it out there on the web for everyone to see. And that got this reaction. None of the policymakers here would have the time or the effort or the interest in sifting through best practices. It was not going to help them in their day-to-day problem-solving policymaking. So we could discard that idea. Even more tangible, this is a process where 3 agencies are collaborating, redesigning food safety control, taxation control, and occupational safety for businesses in Denmark. What you're seeing here is a prototype, where the logos of each agency are on the prototype here of a pamphlet, and there's also a website. But there's nothing in the pamphlet. What we're doing is we're co-designing what should be in the pamphlet together with the business owner who's sitting here at the table. We are rehearsing and checking out and enacting the future together with the people we want to impact. And we're, by the way, doing it collaboratively across 3 different agencies, which is the first time they've really collaborated in that way. We even did a physical map of a layout of a restaurant to see which agency is doing what, where, how, and when. And what would it take to build a one-stop shop where there's only one point of contact for business, reducing red tape and bureaucracy and and administrative burden for that difference. Or we can check out the future like doing role plays or enactments or video filming stick figures like here. We can test new digital solutions, in this case where we're looking at a new digital mentor platform for unemployed citizens and discovering that what might work in one context might not work in another context. So in this case, we said, well, if we were to develop a national platform for digital mentor relationships, like a LinkedIn for unemployed people, where an unemployed person could get in touch with somebody in a job who might then network with them and help them find a job. It kind of matters whether you, as this girl, you're a young graduate from university who's prepared to go digital, and of course this would be great in connecting with others, or you have a mental disability and are trying to get back to the labor market, or you have maybe just a mental health issue and trying to get back to the labor market. You don't want to meet a stranger on the internet. You probably want a handheld, personal, very sort of delicate process of being nudged into the labor market and having a trusted relationship with a mentor. So probably not very digital. And informing this back into the system and saying to the director in charge of this idea, well, it's an interesting idea, but the way it might work in practice is in this way. And by the way, other organizations like, for example, professional associations have already developed the idea. But we could support them, we could fund them, we could maybe build the backbone for them to enable this to happen. So recognizing that there's lots and lots of things going on outside in the world, and we're never developing ideas on a blank slate, we need to go out and test them in the world. Finally, the missing link between governance and design is leadership. It is, what does it take to get there? And if any of you were to start a design project with a public institution, you may want to use this as a bit of a checklist to say, is it likely that the manager I work with, the team that I work with, could display any of these types of engagements, attitudes to what we're doing? If not, I would say you will have a very, very, very slim chance of success at all. Because it is the leaders, the managers, they have to take charge, they make the decisions. You can build, and this may be a provocation to some of you, you can build nice things outside the system. You can build apps, you can build technological platforms, you can build various things, you can build non-governmental organizations. But at least in countries like mine, where government really, really does matter in terms of funding, in terms of regulation, in terms of, and it does in this country too, in terms of the actions of government and the legitimacy of government, you have to get at the core, you have to get at fundamentals of the organization. If that doesn't change, you'd be hard-pressed to see long-term, actual, sustainable change on the outside. So, public managers engaging with design is basically in the center of what we're trying to achieve. But it's so hard to talk about leadership and management without ending up with something very, very fluffy. We'll see whether what I'm going to be saying is fluffy as well. But leadership, I mean, everybody will say when a failed change initiative or failed innovation, usually we say, well, it was bad leadership. It was not good management. But what is the kind of management style we're looking for? With these kinds of discovery processes that's disruptive, that are challenging, sometimes deeply challenging to the cultures and the people we work with. So one of my co-advisors will be here actually tomorrow, Dick Boland, and his colleague Fred Colopy wrote this excellent book in 2004 anthology called Managing as Designing. Warmly recommended. And whenever I give this quote to a group of public managers, and is there anyone here in the room who is actually a public manager? Hello.
State of New York.
State of New York. Do you recognize this situation?
I know. Oh, managers are terms that are non-governmental personally responsible. The last part depends. The last part, which is that we have no firm basis for judging one solution as superior to another, it still must proceed. In some things I encounter in the state that is correct, and other things that is not correct.
So sometimes you have known problems, you have known solutions, you have known evidence, and you know what's the right thing to do, and you can do and you can act on it.
Right, or we can say we don't agree and we hobble, and then sometimes no, something is rolled out, hasn't been beta tested, it hasn't been part of collaborative design, and we have either legal or policy responsibilities to implement.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's statutory and sometimes
Yeah.
it's policy.
And sometimes, this is of course the trick with the public sector, sometimes you do things because your political leaders, political masters say that you are going to do it, and then you do it. But the question of course is, and that goes for the political leadership too, do we always know in advance what is it going to take to enhance learning for kids in public schools in New York City? What is it going to take to make sure that we do not have reoffending by our prison inmates leaving jail? What will it take to ensure that single mothers, teen mothers with kids, get an education and a job and thriving and good quality of life and so forth and so forth? And often, the reaction I get from many public managers is that yes, we have to make decisions, even though we do not necessarily know what's the right decision, but we make decisions anyway. And the point, and this is actually a general management point, this is actually not, this text is not about the public sector, it's a management point. But the point is, and maybe especially in the public sector, that in the public sector we negotiate, we try to find consensus, we make decisions, and often we think that a decision is a result. We think that if we just made a decision, a political decision or a management decision, then change is going to happen. But of course, change is not going to happen automatically. It happens when a child experiences a different learning process, or a family has a different opportunity for thriving, or jobs, or whatever. So, the question that is raised by design is, where do we get the different courses of action from? What is the process by which we find out what the courses of action might be? That's the kind of process I just spoke about. That's the kind of process that opens up the problem space, but also opens up the opportunity space for new solutions. So Bowen and Cullopy are saying that if you take a management stance to a project every time, even though you may think you know the solution, or you've done this before, or somebody else has done it before, that there's a possibility for reinvention. Whenever you encounter a problem or a challenge, you see it as an opportunity for reinvention. What kind of public sector would we then have? What kind of organizations might we then have? I find that part of the biggest barrier to innovation in government, and trust me, there are many barriers to innovation in government. You can check out one of my books to see the list. It is basically that there's not a resolve to change things for the better. People have given up. People are cynical, lost vision, and the reaction is, we've tried that, we've done that, it's never going to change, it's too difficult, the system is too big, it's too complex, there's too much resistance from the unions, whatever.
Yeah, because what we're going to do now is, there's a site called Seaman. I have a friend whose daughter is 14 and has children's arthritis. Between 11 and 13, she can't use her hands at all. And she's an artist, and the younger one, who's 12, is a dentist. And they live in South Carolina, and she was trying to get them into the South Carolina Grove, which is a good campus. Like, it's great, but, you know, who knows? They get in, that type of thing. But what we need to do is do this fundraising for ourselves, where we get the project, keep the money, send our kids to whatever school or whatever programs, or whatever after-school programs that they need. That would mean to happen. Individual.
Yeah, good. But so I would say that you can do fundraising if you want to send your kids to private school. But for most kids in this country and in my country, private school is not an option. What is an option is, what is the public sector providing for you? In New York City, I would guess.
If we can raise the funds instead of them raising funds for us, using our money, and we still have to drop out.
Yes, but the premise of what I'm saying today is that we do have a public sector, and we are spending taxpayer money. So I'm not talking about the side where you spend your money on private institutions, but the one where you spend money on public. And that's a legitimate conversation. We can have that maybe at another time.
Yeah, I just wondered if there's any options where we.
I think the option is that actually. I think the option is that what we're talking about here is, no matter whether it's public sector, it's civic sector, it's social sector, what we're asking about, whether it's the Mayo Clinic, it's the Cleveland Clinic, we're asking about any kind of institution that has to do with people's lives, that has to do with options for transforming people's lives in learning, in health, in social affairs. How do we get there? And so it doesn't really matter whether it's private or public. What matters is whether you run organizations that are about making decisions and keeping, doing what we've done for many, many years, sometimes decades, not always with very good results. Or whether it is about opening up the space and saying, what are we even making decisions about? That distinction, of course, is, rough, but let's take a look at what happens when managers begin to engage in design in ways that are informed with that stance, that are informed about a curiosity about, we don't know what kind of decisions we should make about creating institutions, creating governance. And what I find is that probably public managers will never be designers. Public managers will never necessarily think and act like a creative, and that's probably a good thing, because we need public managers who are concerned with the law, with stability, with predictability, with equality, with a political process, with stakeholder engagement, transparency, good governance, all those things. But when it comes to the space where we are trying to tackle unsolved public problems, challenges in society that we haven't tackled well enough, if that is 10% of your job, 20% of your job, or it is your job for a while as a public manager or as a manager in a social organization, how do you engage with the kind of processes I just shared with you in a way that enhances the likelihood that it will lead to something? That's the question. So here are 4 different leadership engagements with design, if you will, a management engagement with design. One is to challenge basic assumptions, to be ready to ask questions about what are we doing here? What are we doing to the kids in this kindergarten? What are we doing to these injured workers that makes them more sick and further removed from the labor market than they already were? What are we doing with these patients that are returning again and again and again to the hospital? Here's a quote, bit of background to the quote. This is a headmaster of a high school in Denmark, and she noted how a government program to introduce transdisciplinary work on science and research theory didn't work, because the kids were combining totally the wrong fields. They were combining math and physics, where the idea was from the government to combine, let's say, math and history, or combine English language and physics. So transdisciplinary across disciplines. Kids didn't get it. So this general studies, it was just inconsistent. The behavior, the human behavior, the choices kids were making was inconsistent with the goals of the government, of the ministry. And so she says, either we don't know what's going on, so let's explore it. Let's explore the motivations and why are the kids doing this. Or there's something wrong with the objectives. There's something wrong with the policy. There's something wrong with the regulation. So as someone just running one out of hundreds of high schools, this headmaster saying, we need a dialogue with the Department of Education about this. And she actually went and had the dialogue with the Department of Education. And she went out and did ethnography, explored kids' experiences, listened to that, observation studies, and she engaged a whole committee of teachers to redesign the program. Another perspective is to focus on outcomes and putting outcomes first. You might also say it's back to this empathy point about who are we actually serving? Professional empathy, as I mentioned. So get this quote. This is a quote from a leader of an institution for adult mentally handicapped individuals. The institution won the National Innovation Awards in Denmark 4 years ago. I know it quite well. I was on the jury back then, still am. And she says, my job is to give users, the adult mentally handicapped people, what they need, because they have nowhere else to go. It varies from country to country, city to city, but some public services are monopolies by nature. For example, in the United States, as in my country, the IRS, that's monopoly. There's no competition. That is the only institution you will be engaging with as a taxpayer. You have nowhere else to go. And if you try to go somewhere else, they will probably find you at some point. So she says they cannot go anywhere else. This is the city of Odense. There are not that many offers. this is the offer we have. It's free to use. You go there, it's a workshop. You may have an IQ of 70 or 50 or 45, but you can go and you can do some manual labor and you can get paid a little bit. And she says, my responsibility is that citizens come before my staff. If I have to make the choice between who do I care for, citizens come first. And the pattern that I'm seeing across the board in transformations in government, radical transformations in performances, that not every employee, not everyone in the staff can be part of the journey. They can't. 5%, 10%, in this case 10%, cannot be part of the journey. You have to let them go. And government systems that are designed in ways where you cannot let go of staff become dysfunctional. In the European Union, for example, which has its major challenges, in the European Commission, which is the executive body of the European Union, 30,000 employees, according to one HR manager I spoke to, 30,000 employees. In 15 years, they've had let one person go because of low performance. I run leadership training for the directors of that institution, and they are livid that they cannot finally, at some point, after everything else has been tried, say goodbye to staff that are just not going to be part of the journey to something that works better for people or for policymakers or whatever they're doing. It is a performance issue, and I'm saying when you work with design, when you work with outcomes, when you work with what changed outside in the actual world you're trying to enact, not everyone will necessarily be part of the journey, and these managers that I've interviewed for my thesis, they always put citizens before internal staff. If it comes down to that. Third, engagement or attitude in engaging with design that I find perhaps the most critical. Well, the other one is pretty critical too. But trust me, also from my work at MindLab, I'm finding this one really, really critical. It is, how do you lead a process where you don't know where you're going? How do you manage employees? How do you manage staff? How do you manage expectations? How do you manage stakeholders? You really cannot tell where you're going. Meta, the director of the school, the high school you heard about before, she said at one point to me that it's a loss of control. You lose control over a process for a period. And that goes for the staff, but also for you as a manager. And she characterized it as a positive loss of control. But not very many public managers in a system where predictability, control, clear expectations, accountability is key, will feel very comfortable with losing control for a while. Not forever, but for a while. And what these managers do is actually first to introduce disruptions. Because they put outcomes first, they start with saying, let's do the ethnography. Let's experience what citizens are experiencing. Like the manager who said, if we don't do this, we die. When she said that, she said, I am giving the authority and the legitimacy for a process of exploration where we may be surprised. We may find out stuff that is painful. When the director of the Danish Board of Industrial Injuries allowed for ethnography among injured citizens, she allowed insights, experiences that were painful for her staff to look at and listen to, because it wasn't what they expected. And they were running the system that caused these outcomes. So here's another example on stewarding the unknown from the UK, where Peter Gaston here commissioned a design project with a design firm called Think Public, where they introduced, staff video filmed each other having interviews with the homeless applicants for homelessness services. Again, the reaction was somewhat mixed. We are now going to video film each other's interaction with citizens, because no public organization, or no private organization for that matter, gets it right every time. You kind of, no strategy, no organization, no system really survives meeting reality. And in this case, for example, they discovered that they were having a practice of letting children of immigrants who did not speak English, parents didn't speak English, kids did speak English, translate the conversation between the social worker and the parents about the fact that the family didn't have a place to live. That's against policy. They didn't even think about it. They just did it. but they could now have a conversation because they had video footage that they themselves, which makes it quite legitimate, they themselves captured, and they could run workshops. And the thing about all of this is that it is not a question of blaming. It is not a question of evaluating. It is not a question of pointing fingers. It's a question of getting insight and information that will help you drive a different future, drive change, drive you. So we're not spending a lot of time, either also at MindLab, on saying that's terrible, or why do you do that, or we're saying, so how might we use that for getting some ideas about how to change it? Yeah. That's a management process to deal with that pain in that process. These managers introduce it, they introduce disruptions, but they also navigate it and help their staff and say, for example, I know this is tough, I know that we don't know where we're going, but trust me, we'll get there. Give you a final example here from New York. The engagement, of course, is also with this prototyping and with the enactment of a possible future. And managers who I can see are successful in engaging with design, they do also, they are curious about what things will look like. Some of them even begin to build their own prototypes, like a head nurse who builds a prototype of a new patient journal just on her PC. She just writes it up. Or people who start sketching. Again, they're not designers per se, but they engage with the design process. And so this is an example. How many of you know the iZone program here in New York City? Yeah. So you better correct me if I'm not getting this case right. So this is a still from a video done by Seth Schofield, who's now running iZone. When I interviewed Seth, he told me about how at one point he, as a principal of Olympus Academy, was in a workshop organized by the Department of Education, and was asked to envision how might a school with maybe 100% or maybe 80% virtual learning look like. And he and his deputy just pushed themselves to come up with the craziest vision, the wildest vision they could of what might a school that was 100% digital, all learning materials were digital, what might it look like. And when they had brainstormed and came back with this future scenario, the iZone team gave them a goodie bag with including a video camera, a flip camera. Said, that's great, that's a nice little vision you got there. Go to the school, make the film about that future, and come back in 14 days and show us. What will the future actually look like? And I went back. This student is a star in the film, it's a 3-minute film, and came back with a very, very tangible future of what might the school end up looking like. And today, according to Seth, that vision is more than reality. They have more digital learning tools than they thought they would have, they have better PCs than they thought they would have, and they radically transformed Olympus Academy to be a place that's really pioneering new learning models. Queens.
Spell that iZone.
iZone, I-Z-O-N-E, iZone, like innovation zone. And the point of my story, by the way, is that this might sound like a little thing in one institution where you enact a future and you enable it to become a reality because the film becomes a tool or a prototype for engaging staff, kids in the redesign. But it's also a policy-making point because, as far as I'm informed, the city of New York would have to change regulation about tardiness or about attendance. Because how can you have virtual learning environments where kids have to attend physically the classroom? You have to change regulation as well. So this is also a point about how service design drives policy design or drives regulation. It matters how we regulate because that governs how kids like him are experiencing his daily life in school. Okay. I'm going to conclude with just a couple of questions for you, perhaps, or just open up the floor for whatever you have to shoot with. But I think there's an issue about how to strike the right balance between principles we begin to see and believe in about how to govern on the one hand, and then maybe the more explorative, sometimes more bottom-up process of discovery. There are issues around some of the things we're discussing and exploring in the MacArthur network about which digital tools can enable and empower how we drive the process for everything from doing distributed ethnography, which is something that, for example, David Snowden, that I mentioned about complexity, that his consultancy is actually doing at large scale using mobile smartphones as ethnographic tools, to crowdsourcing ideas, something we, for example, did with the European Union. We crowdsourced 140 ideas about European policy for innovation by engaging stakeholders. Or, obviously, the role of digital in almost anything, almost any enactment of what government is trying to do to impact citizens today. We can almost not think of any policy or any service that wouldn't have digital components. So what's the role of digital in the design process? And finally, and that's a long conversation, what will it take for public managers to really engage in the design process? Can it be learned? Can we train them in executive training? Should we put it into management curriculum at graduate schools? Is it just a question of picking the right managers to work with? That's maybe the easy way out. How do we go about that? That's it. Thanks for listening, and happy to hear your questions.
Well, thanks, Christian, and I'm sure everyone in the room probably has answers to your questions. But I would like to start with a question myself, because I absolutely have no answers to those questions. And then open up. But throughout your presentation, the concept of outcomes is central. Right? But how does the design process also then engage with actually figuring out whether the outcome was met? Right? I mean, it's like, because that seems to be like the ultimate that you want to know is, have you actually made an impact?
Yes.
And so, to what extent is that part of the process that you design, or to what extent should it be part of the process? And how would you go about it?
So, the paradox is that design processes are often really concerned with exploring what outcomes look like today. So the ethnography, the deep dives, the exploration of people's lives show us what they look like. Thriving, how learning happens, how health is produced or not produced, how dysfunction, and sometimes how we actually end up almost ruining people's lives as an outcome. But we've yet to see design processes very much engaged in when we then change things, when we then begin to introduce change. We actually have to go back and do the deep dives and look at how exactly is this changing. To give you an example, when we worked with the Danish Board of Industrial Injuries, we helped them redesign a format for the conversation between an injured citizen and various agencies around settling their insurance claim. When we first looked at the process, we did observation studies in the meeting rooms. Citizens didn't know what the meeting was about. They were confused about the conversation and felt alienated. And when they finally, at the end of the conversation, received a check of, let's say, $100,000, because the point of the meeting was to settle the insurance claim right then and there. It was like Christmas Eve. They had no idea they were supposed to get money. After the redesign of the service journey and the service process around this particular meeting, the whole sequence was different, the preparation of expectations was different, and we went out and observed it again. So we went out and took another look at how does this process happen, and where the outcome is the insurance settlement. Now it gets a lot more tricky when you look at what the real outcome is of that process, because it's not about the money, it's about getting a job again. So what's the service journey about helping a formerly injured worker into a job? And that becomes tricky because that's a long-term process, it's not just an observation you can do at one point. And I would say that we are lacking the tools in our public service systems to rigorously explore over time how outcomes are then happening as a consequence of change. I know that Jesper, who was here, talked about how we work with the Danish Department of Labor, Employment Ministry, to look at the ongoing production of new outcomes qualitatively as a reform is unfolding and feeding that back into the system. So actually, my answer would be about creating feedback loops that are qualitative, but also, of course, quantitative. Looking at what are the numbers, what are the figures that we also have in our metrics on. But I would say that I think the revolution from design would be to build an ongoing exploration of what outcomes look like as part of the organizational fabric of an organization. So it's not a one-off, it's not a project, it's not a nice design thing, it's something that we do and we're curious about, so we can continue to invent, adjust, change radically or not so radically, whatever is needed. And so this is an agenda for future exploration, I think. It's something we don't have the capability to yet in most public organizations.
Great, thanks. Any,
Yeah, that's a question. So I work with the state, so for instance, digital issues. We've got not only lack of access to digital technologies because of income level, which is pervasive. That's no matter where you are. But the morality where people maybe over 20% of the state's population doesn't actually have access to connectivity. Like they don't have cell towers, they don't have underground or broadband, or they've got hookups to the telephone.
Modem.
They don't have TV reception. I'm just curious where there have been efforts to even was a tremendous opportunity to think about governance, and that's great that that's happening. How have they dealt with issues of public access to digital tools, reporting, opportunities, that kind of connectivity? How have they dealt with that?
Also, I think Europe.
You don't have a lot of rural.
Yeah, well, East and Central Europe, huge areas of the continent. Same issues. We would do mapping of digital. For example, we did a major project at MindLab on digital trade or cross-border trading. In the UK, you can 85% of all stores are online in the UK.
Right.
In Romania, it's probably 13% or something. I mean, that scale, which also means that's a reflection also of not just of online shopping, but the fact that actually citizens don't have access to the internet or to digital tools. So we have tremendous gaps in connectivity in Europe as well. And even in my country, which is in Scandinavia, and it's small and flat and pretty easy to. Some people are not online. Older citizens, senior citizens are not online. But I think that gap is being closed. It has been closing rapidly. There may be pockets in the state here that won't close for a long time. It raises the point that digital by default, like the UK government is proposing, and actually in Denmark we're proposing too, is something we have to be a little bit careful with. Digital by default risks excluding groups that can access. Digital by default means also excluding surprising groups. So let me give you an example very briefly.
Did you say surprising?
Surprising groups. So in Denmark, the age group in my country, which is very digital, the whole country, the age group that is least likely to be able to do their taxes online are young people aged 18 to 30. Least likely. Radically less likely than anyone from 35 and up.
Is that because they don't want to?
It is not because they don't want to. It is not because they don't want to. That always becomes a discussion when we talk about the tax ministry.
No, it's a sneaky age.
But what it actually is that they don't understand the system.
Right. It's
the use of a system that they don't understand.
Right.
So they are the most digital generation ever in my country.
For something.
Digital natives. But they don't understand the logic of the system. But guess what? If you're 45 or you're 50 or you're 55 years old, you have online access, and you've been sweating at your kitchen table over tax forms your entire life, every year. You know the forms, you know the system, you know the logic, you read the books. And now the whole form is just online, it's just on the screen instead of on the kitchen table. It's actually easier for you. But for kids who's never seen the form before, it makes no sense. And the new thing is, there's no human interaction. There's no telephone call. You can't get through. There's no physical. We're taking away all the physical entry points, citizen service centers. They're taking them away. You just have to do it online, and then you make mistakes. And nobody wants to make mistakes with the tax.
They don't have any free services.
People do in Denmark. A lot of people do taxes for themselves, and also we're trying to make taxation so simple and automatic that we don't need.
I mean, do they have like here, for instance, you go to your taxes done,
no,
and that's it.
We're cutting that away.
The customer service piece with our agency, we have primarily deal with this general public.
Yeah.
We deal with not-for-profit corporations,
Yeah.
a lot like 1,500.
Yes.
The issue is we have, it went all digital, not enough customer service, now have to undo that
Yeah.
part of it to find a
So-
customer service platform.
So I think, so back to outcomes. Digital is great, but we have to start with people. So in the Board of Industrial Injuries, for example, when they digitized case management, they discovered nobody was really using it. And we suggested in a project with them, why don't you make the crazy investment of a phone call to people? The crazy, very, very expensive investment of a single phone call to an injured worker from the agency, much more expensive than a digital platform, is to help people get online. We call it making people digitally self-reliant. And that's an investment of a 5-minute or 10-minute phone call. Hello, we understand you have a serious work injury. We really regret that. We are here to navigate the process for you. Did you know there actually is a website you can log on to? Actually, are you online right now? Would you mind going online? I can just introduce you to the website. Yes, you can do that, this and this and this. This is how you log on. This is where you can see your personal file. This is where we get secure messages. And you can just take it from there. You can just log on and follow your case management process from there. Thank you and goodbye. That idea of understanding what works for human beings and being ready to invest in the phone call. Or in the case I mentioned about people with a mental health issue and unemployment mentoring, maybe we sometimes need to go old school and invest in actual people who are meeting citizens. Maybe that turns out to be the best investment. Why? Because it drives the best outcomes.
Absolutely fascinating line of thought. Let me put two things together and ask a question. The essence of design logic is what we're talking about. It is solutions that are not imposed or not framed from a God's eye view, but from the point of view of people actually experiencing the reality and what will work. And now you talk that through and how one does that. If one takes that logic, the other reality is that people are very different.
Yeah.
And what I've not heard you talking about is how do you, within the bounds of public sector, public policy, which needs to meet standards of fairness, equity, and so on, how do you segment, and then how do you appropriately calibrate adjustments or approaches that are right for one segment against the needs and design experiences of others? How do you think about that?
So you're putting your finger right, of course, on a difficult spot. I mentioned in the beginning when I said, well, it's not about equal rights, it's about equal outcomes, right? Let me give you an example. In Denmark, a new model for in-home health services for aging older citizens has been spreading rapidly across all local governments. Denmark local government provides taxpayer-funded cleaning, getting you dressed, getting you showered, cooking, or meals on wheels, and so forth, for people who are so old and so fragile they can't do it for themselves, but still prefer to live in their own home. 5 years ago, a director, a manager in a local government asked the question, why do we try to put cheaper and cheaper and cheaper labor into older people's homes to do things for them instead of investing in their capability to live the life they want to live in their home, or any life they want to live? And the program is about rehabilitation, called everyday rehabilitation. It's about investing in physical fitness and social relations and tools for your home, redesigning your home, so everything you need so you can be self-sufficient again. And do the things you love doing as an older citizen, and not having someone coming and doing things for you. It's massively successful. 50% of older citizens who usually enter a normal program to get in-home cleaning and care do without any help at all with this investment from across different agencies. 50%. Massive saving, more independence for people, more thriving, higher satisfaction for people. Now that means that I'm 85 years old. I have this, it's a voluntary offer, but it's a pretty clear voluntary offer. And I get to do this for myself, and I have no cleaning help. I have no help at all from government. My neighbor, 85 years old, too fragile or doesn't want to or whatever, gets cleaning every week, gets Meals on Wheels, gets this and this and this. It's not equal rights, but it's the equal opportunity to live the life you want to live. And we're doing this. I mean, we're doing it, and we're backing it up with legislation, and backing it up with funding, we're backing it up with organization. It's I think it's 90% of all local government in Denmark that's doing this now. But it's controversial. What do you think the National Association of Older Citizens are saying? The lobby group is saying. They're saying, yeah, we see it's kind of nice for those few people who can deal with this, but generally we think it's wrong because everybody should have the right to the same treatment.
I think in this country that is the most equal probably services we have, senior services.
Yeah.
What he's saying is every individual is different. At NYU we study the welfare system in your country and how it's done differently.
Yes.
They care about each individual. It's not done like that. So a lot of times when they come up with these programs for people, there's a population that they care about and a population that they don't care about.
Were they? Are they this government?
Government. And, there's no way they're going to give this to this person and also give it to this person. Because over here, we got the gutter, and over here, we got Princess Aside or whatever. And that's the big problem in this country. And that's why the way that you're talking about this whole thing could never compare to you.
Yeah, so I get that a lot.
This is the United States of America. We're special.
Yeah, I get that a lot, and I don't agree, but that's another discussion.
Yeah, exceptional.
All of the point that you think about is, so I'm in an agency, and I'm not an elected official.
No, of course not.
So what's interesting is the special interest, which to some extent is like ingrained in who gets to have and who doesn't have to get, demographics, all kinds of things, status of different types. Then you get the whims / predilections of elected officials who are in office for a very short time, a medium amount of time, what appears to be your entire lifetime, perhaps. If you die in your 50s, then you still be in office. So you've been in office for 60 years, and you don't have term limits, very many. There's only like 2 state legislators that have term limits. New York State doesn't.
Okay.
So how do you deal with sort of coming up with these bottom-up design, disruptive design ideas? Because in government, you really do have to do a lot of positive disruption with a lot of empathy. Is how then do you deal with making something last beyond the tenure of, a governor, a legislature, whoever?
Yeah.
What's your
So on the one hand, the thing is that we, democracy.
They've got a big executive change.
Sure.
Mayor.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
Right.
I'm actually on Bloomberg philanthropy selection committee for the city's challenge, so mayor's challenge. So I follow that closely, of course. Well, that's the thing with democracy, isn't it? That we elect our political masters. Sometimes throw them out again quickly. Sometimes they stay for a long time, and ultimately they get to decide. And one thing that is underexplored, it's an interesting research agenda. I know we've been talking about it as well, Eduardo and I. It's basically what's the relationship between politics and design for policy, design for services. Right. That is underexplored. It's a whole research agenda. It is what would happen if politicians were also engaging with design, or were design thinkers, or were displaying these attitudes. I have run workshops with ministers. I have run workshops with the European Council of Ministers in the European Union. I've run workshops with local government councils. It is a different kind of conversation. Correct. It is at a strategic level. It is also at an ideological level. But I don't think we can say that it is beyond reach to introduce collaboration, intelligent problem solving, visualizing systems, introducing empathy. Remember, what drives most politicians are individual cases. It is empathy with citizens, with businesses. It is, of course, also about interests and so forth. I know that. But it's also about some politicians, at least, wanting to change something that can be felt by an individual, by a group, by a community. And there's a lot of energy in that, and it's our democratic legacy. I think we need to begin to work more openly with some of these processes also at the political level. And I know for a fact it can be done at a level of 500 million citizens, as we did in the European Council. It can be done at local level. It's something we have to rehearse our way into. It is something that is just at the beginning. I don't see that we can just disrupt our entire political process, but I do see that we have some dysfunctionalities in the way democracy is run, in the way we engage interests and stakeholders, so there's a potential for quite a lot of change right there, I think. Yes, please. I guess it's fire rules.
Yeah, that's
Last question. Okay.
But what's the role of the private? So I'm a civic tech startup.
Yeah.
We're trying to do things with open data.
Yeah.
We've been told by investors, hey, do this, and you can sell this data to hedge funds, and they can do things, great things with open data, and there are like lots of successful open data startups doing that.
Yeah.
But we're building things like dashboards for policy.
Yeah, excellent.
And we were, you know, it's tough. So we're not getting support. Venture capitalists, oh yeah, that's. Are you a for-profit startup? Are you an NGO?
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you intend to make money on that?
Yeah.
You know, we're trying to innovate outside and bring that innovation into the public sector.
Yeah. So, speaking of outside and inside, I mean, one of the pieces of advice I would give, of course, is that if government or the public sector is going to be your clients, or going to use and benefit and create value from what you're doing, you need to co-design what you're doing with them. You need to understand who will use it, how and when within the system. You should probably have an advisory board with actual public managers in your advisory board. You should probably look at the business case for what would the benefit be to the public sector system in efficiencies, but also maybe in generating new ideas that could drive outcomes or whatever. Big data is great for finding out about visualizing outcomes, for example, visualizing traffic, getting new insights about human behavior through data. I would say the fallacy of most consultancies or outside work, and I was a consultant for a decade myself to government, is we don't get close up enough. We don't co-design or co-create or develop our solutions with our clients. We do it in the hope that, if we're smart enough, then we can sell it to them. If I were you, I would pioneer a very different way of working with government around this. And then whether it's smartest for you to be a for-profit or not-for-profit, I'm not so sure. Sometimes solutions can sit outside on the board boundaries of government or outside. That's perfectly fine. The same happens in my country. Or it can be plugged into government and maybe become part of the government system. I think you have to find out about how that will be done, but you have to find out with the system, not just selling it to them.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Christian.
Thanks.